Good morning, everyone. A new beginning, a new book. We completed last Shabbat the first book of the Torah, the book of Bereshit, Genesis, which is about beginnings and creation and social disintegration with Noah, and then familial strife with the three generations. The three opening generations of the Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their spouses and descendants. We had the reconciliation last week, and before that of Joseph and his brothers. They descended to Egypt. Why descended to Egypt? This is not a topographical statement. They descended because they left Israel. To this day, if somebody moves to Israel, thank you, we say that person made aliyah. Aliyah means an ascent. This person is spiritually ascending. Leaving Israel is known as a descent in a spiritual sense. And we are in Egypt. We live in the Beverly Hills of Egypt in a place called Goshen, which is a very affluent area, fertile soil. Everything is great. And now, as we open the new book, we're moving from family, an extended family, into nationhood, the new facet of our identity. Torah starts with individuals, Adam, then Adam and Eve, Noah, Abram and Sarah, and now we are a nation. The Torah portion in the book we use, the Rabbi Kaplan translation of the Torah, Rabbi Kaplan Zatzal, is in page 258, 259. And the Torah starts with the words, the portion in the book starts with the word Ve'ele Shemot. These are the names. 259. So notice, so Shemot is the name of our book in Hebrew, right? What's the name of our book in English? This book, what is the English name? In Hebrew we call it Shemot. Bereshit, Shemot. In English it's called Exodus.
I was going to say Exodus.
Why do we call it Exodus? Is it after the boat from 1946?
Going out of Egypt.
Exactly, from the word exiting.
Exodus.
Right?
The Greek word for out is exodus,
right, the Greek
out.
word for out. Thank you. And getting out of Egypt, exiting Egypt, whereas the Hebrew name of the book is different. It comes from the word Shemot. These are the names of the children of Israel. So names are big in our tradition, right? Avram becomes Avraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, Jacob becomes Israel. So name denote in Judaism also a spiritual potential. So these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt, Jacob and the members of his household, and the Torah goes on to enumerate the 11 sons, excluding Joseph, who was already there, and of course sister, daughter Dinah, and then we learn in verse 6 that Joseph passed away, and all those of that first generation, the first generation of immigrants, they passed away. And now the people we have in Egypt are only those who are already Egyptian born. They had an Egyptian passport. Verse 7, it says, the children of Israel, henceforth we were known as the children of Israel, were fruitful and multiplied. So we had a huge demographic leap, right? We're in verse 7. We had a huge demographic leap. Rashi says that many women had, what do you call it in English? Sixplets? Is there such a thing as sixplets?
Multiple birth?
Yeah, no, 6 kids in one birth.
A sextuplet? I mean,
yeah. Exactly. But not like what's the name of that woman in America who had 8 babies? Octa mother, something like Have you heard about the Octomom? There's a woman in America. She became very famous. She had 8 babies.
8 babies at one time.
At one time, yeah.
Nice.
So we didn't get to her level, but we were certainly in demographic rise. Now come verse 8, and trouble begins. I'm translating the Hebrew in my own words. And a new Vayakom Melech Chadash, a new king arose in Egypt, who knew not Joseph. Right? This is what we're reading now is very exciting, because we're reading a pattern of Jewish history where a ruler sees the Jewish people's potential for innovation and contribution and economic growth, and he invites the Jewish people to come and reside. And after a while, either that same leader or one of his successors say, the Jewish people excel, I feel threatened, they're so successful. They're so educated, they have such great know-how, they're so diligent, and they do well. And then bad things happen as a result, either expulsions or persecutions. And that's exactly what happens here. It's interesting that Rashi quotes from the Talmud that there is a debate in the Talmud whether the new king in Egypt was actually another person, or the same Pharaoh had a change of heart. So I was trying to think, what can we learn from this? Maybe it can teach us that sometimes even we ourselves can stop appreciating someone who is doing good things for us and just feel antagonistic. In any event, it's an interesting debate you have in the Talmud between Rav and Shmuel, 2 great rabbinic sages, whether it was the same Pharaoh who had a change of heart or a new Pharaoh who was anti-Semitic from the get-go, to use an anachronistic term. Verse 9. And this is very interesting. Verse 9, now look at the beginning of the anti-Semitic propaganda. And he said to his people, the new Pharaoh, or the old new Pharaoh says to his people, he starts the anti-Semitic propaganda. Even with Nazism, it started with propaganda. The Nazis had a magazine, so to speak, called Der Stürmer, which was a viciously vile anti-Semitic magazine. They had a man called, his name escapes me when it comes better, he was Joseph Goebbels. He was the minister of propaganda for the Germans, for the Nazis, and they started to depict the Jews as non-humans in many ways. They said, right, exactly, the most vicious genocidal version of fake news, and the Jews control everything, and blah, blah, blah. Very similar. Look, verse 9. The Pharaoh says to his people, Hinei am b'nei Israel, behold the people of the children of Israel. They are mightier and stronger than we are. Remember those anti-Semitic caricatures of like a caricature, anti-Semitic caricature of an ultra-Orthodox Jew embracing the globe with claws and with a crooked nose. And again, Egypt is the United States of Egypt of the ancient Near East. It's the sole superpower. And here he's saying, the new Pharaoh is saying, the Jews are stronger than us, right? By the way, the percentage of Jews in Nazi Germany, there were about 760 to 780,000 Jews in Germany in a population of 80 million. So the Jews were not even 1%. Not even 1%, you know? And so, and notice also another fascinating thing about anti-Semitism, and I'm talking about real monstrous anti-Semitism, both here and in the 20th century with Nazism. The Jews are either dehumanized, they are made to look like mice or rats or roaches, or they are superhumanized to be stronger than everyone, right? And to control everything. It's either the Jews are superhumans who can just take over everything, or the Jews are subhuman. Exactly. Exactly. So in psychology, it's called splitting. When you either love someone or you hate someone, but you can't have a normal attitude towards them. Very interesting analogies between the first recorded genocide, because remember, Pharaoh is going to decree the murder of all the Jewish male infants, right? So this is the first genocidal campaign against their people. Look at the striking analogies between 20th century Europe and ancient Egypt. Verse 10. Hava nitchakmalo. Let's outsmart them. The Jews are smart, but let's outsmart them. I want to say something before that, please, for verse 9. Pharaoh said to his people, here is the people of Israel. So notice that Pharaoh is saying, he's calling us the people of Israel. Pharaoh is the first character in the Torah, in all the historical records that we have for that fact here, that says, that calls us a people, a nation.
But actually, we're not a nation, though, because we haven't gone out to Israel. Is that?
Well, we are like a nation within a nation.
Okay.
We're in Egypt. And it's a very important thing. How do you define yourself? You know, sometimes it happens that Jews are reminded that they are Jewish because of anti-Semitism. There are a lot of Jews who are very comfortable in Germany and in Iran and in Iraq and in Poland and in Russia and in Morocco, until at some point they were reminded that they are different, that they're Jewish, right? From their anti-Semitic environment.
From their beliefs? Like, we have a different God.
Well, because of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitic gaze, G-I-Z-E, of course, reminded them that they were Jewish. You know, there were people who went to the camps who were so removed from Jewish life that they were going to churches in Europe. And people in the church were saying, what happened to this one? What happened to that one? They were sent because they had a Jewish grandparent. So basically we see that we have two options as Jews. It's either we embrace Judaism with joy, and we are part of a Jewish community, and we enjoy the friendship and the social aspects of it, and all the programs and the spirituality and the education and the culture. Or, tragically, we are at times reminded by the anti-Semitic other that we are Jewish. And I think the healthier Jewish identity is the one that you embrace on your own, rather than being imposed. That identity is imposed on you from the outside. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said about that. There's a lot to be said about that.
I don't know if you, can I say something?
Yeah, please.
I don't know if you read the book by Alan Dershowitz. Devotes an entire book to saying that Judaism survived better when there was antagonism toward Jews. In other words,
You know,
it
it's...
to stay together because of the anti-Semitism, and since it's gone to such a low
Hey,
level,
Judith, welcome.
Here in the
Here,
US.
please grab a... yeah.
there's assimilation.
Yeah, this is Professor Dershowitz's argument is a very common argument, and it's certainly there's a lot of truth in it, that we see that we have a demographic decline in when we are secure. There's more assimilation. However, you know, in Nazi Germany, right before the Holocaust, in the late 20s, Hitler came to power in 1933. There were higher assimilation rates in Germany than in America. And another point that's maybe even more pertinent, today there are more people studying Torah in yeshivas around the world than at any other point in Jewish history. More than in Babylonia in Talmudic times, more than in Eastern Europe before the Holocaust. So, on the one hand, yeah, we are witnessing a demographic decline and somewhat unprecedented assimilation in North America. By the way, not in North America. In Canada, there's very low assimilation. In France, I think assimilation is not in high. But, you know, it's a very complicated picture. It's a very complicated picture. But certainly there is something to it, that a lot of people who kind of don't enrich themselves with the beauty and sanctity and depth and joy of Jewish life are kind of coerced into the Jewish box by anti-Semites, and when you don't have anti-Semites, then those people are not as Jewishly engaged. But I prefer to have that problem, But it's an interesting discussion. Verse 10, book of Exodus, right? So Pharaoh says, "Hava nitchakmalo." Let's outsmart the Jews. Penir be. Let they become even more multiply even more, and become even more prominent, because they excel in the life of the mind. That's my addition. Va'haya ki tikraena milchama. Suppose there is a war, let's say between Egypt and another local power. Venosaf gamhu al son'enu. And they will also hate us. Venilcham banu v'ala minat. And they will fight against us and come out of Egypt. In other words, it's what we call in English a fifth column. What if another country attacks Egypt and the Jews make an alliance with that other country and attack us from within? So here we have another anti-Semitic discourse, right? The so-called dual loyalty, right? That the Jews are not really good citizens, which is, of course, a preposterous claim, because if you look at the facts, Jews contribute to American charities. I'm not talking Jewish American charities writ large, more than any other ethnic group, right? And we see this charge again that the local Jewish people are not going to remain loyal in times of need. Again, it's false. Another indication of that is that in World War I, Jewish German soldiers recruited or served in the army and also died in higher numbers than their percentage in the population, right? Much more than their number in the population. So we see all this discourse once again, and it's amazing to see. What we see here is the birth of the vile anti-Semitic discourse. So we read this chapter and we see historical patterns that repeat for centuries in many parts of Europe, the Middle East, and other parts of the world as well. Is there anything else that I wanted to add here? No, I think we're good. Okay. Verse 11. So notice the first step of the anti-Semitic genocidal campaign is the Jews are too powerful and the Jews are disloyal. Now for the third phase, verse 11. Vayasimu alav sarei misim. So they appointed over them tax collectors. Sounds familiar? Under Islam, Jews were known as dhimmis, second-class citizens. And in some countries, at certain point in history, they had to pay more taxes. And in Christian medieval Europe as well, Jews also had to pay higher taxes. Jews were not allowed to own land. Why do you think Jews excel so much in economic life? Because we were not allowed to own land in Europe. Because we're Jewish, we were Jewish. So they gave us the only profession we were allowed to practice by the local rulers was money lending. That's why we pioneered early banking. We were pushed into it.
Well, it's also because we had to be mobile.
That's true, but here we didn't have a choice. In medieval Europe. Mm-hmm. In any event, you see in verse 11 that there is discriminatory taxation against the Jews, and we start building store cities in which you save your whatever it is that you're keeping in an agrarian society, supplies, right? It's like the warehouses, so to speak, and these are Pitom and Ramses. Now here's a fascinating historical point. That's what I wanted to tell you, friend. This is very exciting. Ramses, in Hebrew Ramses, is one of the pharaohs, And we actually have in the Cairo Museum in Egypt, and of course you can see it online, you can see it, an image of it online. We have an ancient engraving that goes back maybe 3000 BCE, I'm not sure exactly, maybe 2000 BCE, and it's in ancient Egyptian, and it says, "Behold, Israel is laid to waste. Her seed is no more."
It says that?
It says that, yeah. And here, you know, and who wrote it? The son of Ramses II. It's from his era. Let me find.
It's you can actually see it today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the oldest reference in archaeological finding that shows our people's servitude, in this case in Egypt.
Amazing.
Oh, so you know how people are always looking for proof?
Yeah.
There's proof.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here it is. It's called the. Yeah, I'll show you in a second. It says. It's called the Merneptah Stele. Merneptah. And the second word stele is Stele. And this is known as the Israel Stele, or the Vic Stele, Stele.
I don't know that word.
Is an inscription by the ancient Egyptian king. It says 1213 to 1203. Okay, so this is what, this is like 33 centuries ago. Discovered in 1896, now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Israel. I'll take you straight to that one.
And what does it say again, this inscription?
It says,
Our seed is no more.
Israel is laid to waste. His seed/grain is no more. So let me show you two things. A is, maybe it's hard to see, but this is in ancient Egyptian, the script.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see?
Yeah.
It's in ancient Egyptian. Google that term I gave you at your own time, and you can read many things about it. And this is how it looks in the Egyptian Museum.
On that stela.
Yeah. Stella, that's how it's pronounced? Yeah. That's how it looks in the Jewish Museum. So, in the Egyptian Museum. So, a very interesting historical fact that really embarrassed a lot of scholars of the biblical era, because there was a time with the rise of secularism, both in Germany and in other places, that a lot of people, for ideological reasons, they wanted to say, "Oh no, we don't have historical proof for this and that," and they had their own agenda to undermine religious life. And of course, we see now that it's very much here. Now, what did I do with? Let me take us back
I'm trying
to the
think
text.
about the difference between Morocco and Egypt, and as Jews living
Yes.
in both countries.
Uh-huh.
I don't know, in Morocco, if there was anything like that, how would we would have felt
Mm-hmm.
living in a country where they said, and yet in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
the Jews at a certain time were flourishing.
Yeah. And, a few years before Hitler, Ymach Shmo, came to power, Germany had a Jewish foreign minister. His name was Walter Rathenau. He was murdered, but he was foreign minister. You know, it's kind of like in America, right? When you had Madeleine Albright or you had Henry Kissinger. That's an indication, you know, that the Jews were, you know, the Jews excelled in German culture. And now Morocco in modern times was relatively benign compared to other places. But in earlier times, you know, in the times of Maimonides, in the 12th century, the Mujahideen, and now Hamas has their own terror groups named after the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen of the 12th century, when Maimonides lived, they basically said, you at some points you either convert or we behead you. You know, that's why Maimonides left Spain, and then he left Morocco, then he went to Israel, and then he finally settled in Egypt. So it depends on the historical time. You know.
Can you spell the name for that stela once more?
Can somebody give it?
I can give it to you.
Because I already moved to another
It's,
page.
It's MERNEPTAH.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you.
So,
It's okay.
so as you see, this is all very, very rich stuff. Now here comes the definition of the Jewish people.
Where?
One definition of the Jewish people. Verse 12. Let me tell you a story before we read that verse. The story is that the President of the United States is being told by his National Security Advisor that in 48 hours the whole world is going to be flooded, and there's nothing we can do about it, so we have to just let the religious communities know. And the President calls the chief imam of the Islamic world, the Pope, the chief rabbi, and all the representatives of all the different religions. And they all go to their respective constituencies and say, let us pray together as brothers and sisters, because the world will be no more in 48 hours. The rabbi goes on Israeli television and says, friends, we have 48 hours to learn how to live underwater.
Or
Right?
how to build houses on stilts.
So
Build boats. Find a plank to.
I heard another story like this. I have to tell you.
That is
So-
definitely Jews. We have 48 hours to live.
Find a log to strap yourself.
And a French, a German, an Italian, and an Israeli order coffee. They all get a fly in their coffee. The Italian shouts and asks for tea instead. The German throws out the fly, throws out the coffee, and cleans the cup really well. The French guy eats the fly and drinks the coffee. The Israeli guy sells the fly to the French guy, sells the coffee to the Italian guy, invents a new machine that blocks flies from falling into coffee places, and sells the coffee to the German guy, and gets tea to be reimbursed. So that's I kind of messed up the joke, but
No, but I get
Good, we got it.
the second joke is about innovation.
Innovative,
Right.
yeah.
The first joke is about resilience, how to be able to survive in the most adverse of circumstances. And that's us. Look at what happened. That's Jewish history. For example, in the year 70 we lost the temple, and in the 2nd century we were expelled from Israel. So the rabbis had to figure out how to do the impossible. What's the impossible? How can a nation survive in exile, without a land of its own, without what we call today political sovereignty, and without a military? So they said, the book is our new home. The prayer book is our home. The Torah that we read in synagogue is our home. The Talmud, which is the guide to how to live a Jewish life, is our home. We moved from territorial sovereignty to what I call textual sovereignty. The text as sovereignty. Right? And there's beautiful literature about it. The German Jewish poet Heinrich Heine was such a great poet that even during the era of the Nazis, the Germans would teach his poems at school, and they would write written by an unknown poet. And then George Steiner is a contemporary or late 20th century literary critic. He came up with the ideas for Jews, the text is homeland. In other words, we had to always reinvent ourselves, right? And nobody else, when the Dalai Lama was exiled, Tibet was kind of exiled, taken over by the Chinese, he went to learn from rabbis, and he came to Israel how to survive in exile as a spiritual minority. And then during the Crusades of the 1100s, we had a new upsurge of mystical innovation, known as the Hasidim of Ashkenaz. After the expulsion from Spain, we had the Spanish Kabbalists, the Sephardic Kabbalists of Tzfat in the 1500s, and of course we have seen our people's rise from the camps to the modern state of Israel in 3 years' time. So you look at this verse 12, and it tells you that story of Jewish resilience. We're like the phoenix, right?
Actually, we're just like cockroaches. We just keep on living.
Oh.
Exactly. Well, verse 12. The more they were afflicted and tortured, meaning the Jewish people, the more they multiplied and gained strength. Sounds familiar? Mm-hmm. That's the Jewish people. You see what an amazing thing the Torah is? It's telling us a story of thousands of years to come. Right? It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
You have to be blind not to see how prophetic and holy this is, how incredible that is.
History is repeating itself.
Big time, right?
Yeah, over and over.
Verse 13. ויעבדו מצרים את בני ישראל בפרך. So now it's a slave labor, it's camps time. So let's look at the evolution of anti-Semitism. First, they say, the Pharaoh says, and this is a precursor to all the monstrous anti-Semitic eras and rulers, the Jews are too powerful. Then they say the Jews are disloyal. Then they tax us like there's no tomorrow and discriminate against us. And then we still somehow manage to keep ourselves on our feet and find blessings in adversity and survive and even thrive. And the next part is the camps. Verse 13. So the Egyptians enslaved the children of Israel with back-breaking labor. Right? Verse 14. And they bittered their lives with hard work, hard labor. That's the camps. When people came to the camps, Dr. Mengele Machshmo would perform the selection and say, look at the person and see if they're fit for hard labor or not. Only those who could work hard labor could survive. Right? There you go. It's all here. It's all here.
There's a book I just finished reading called Under the Scarlet Sky, and it's a story that took place in Italy. Not a story, it's historical fiction in Italy, but it's from the non-Jewish perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw the people, the Germans making the Jews labor, lifting rocks, building roads and bridges and things like that. And it was interesting to hear him describe it, and it was back just like in Egypt. It was then, and it was a kid observing. It's actually based on a true man, who lived, still is alive. Told his story.
It's a whole question we're going to get to with Pharaoh's daughter and what are the roles of bystanders, which has to do with what you're saying.
Well, this guy was a righteous guy, so
sure.
Yeah, but
sure.
What is the position of the bystander?
So we'll get to it. Verse 15. Now the Pharaoh issues an order to the Hebrew midwives. I guess there were two who are the leading midwives. Maybe everybody trained with them to become midwives. We don't really know. One was called Shifra, which is a a name that's used in Israel to this day, and the other was called Pua. Less frequent, but also a name that you can hear nowadays too. According to Rashi, Shifra and Pua were Miriam and Yocheved. Miriam, of course, Moses' sister, and Yocheved, her mother.
Wait a minute. Why would they have different names?
Rashi explains that Shifra means Meshaperet, she would improve the condition of the newborn, and Pua, she would talk like a to the babies. Okay. In any event, verse 16, and he says to the midwives, the Pharaoh says, check at Cedar Sinai when a Jewish baby is born. God forbid that it should be at Cedar Sinai, but check at the hospital and see.
Why did you say that?
It's a joke. And see if it's a boy or a girl. If it's a boy, dispose of him. If it's a girl, she should live.
Why did they want to get rid of the boys?
Well, I think the rationale was, especially in a very patriarchal society, that the boys would be assertive about maintaining their heritage, and the girls would just be Egyptianized, and they would be taken by Egyptian men, and they would just merge into the Egyptian culture.
Are changed when they get married. They lose their identity when they marry into a society, while men keep their identity back in those days. And besides, they're the one with the seed.
So, verse 17. But the midwives feared God. That's also very connected to the Holocaust, because there's a village in France. I'm too lazy to Google and get you the name now. If you email, contact me later, I'll get it for you. There's a village in France, a religious village, Christian, of course, that saved an incredible amount of Jews during the Holocaust. And and some people who saved Jews during the Holocaust were religious Gentiles.
Yeah.
And for them it was, like in French, you say, c'est normal. Yeah. It's like the normal thing to do. Of course you're not going to let a person be treated like a dog. Of course, how could you live with yourself if your neighbor that you've known for 30 years is going to be sent to a concentration camp? Of course you're going to try and save that soul, that fellow human being. And here, fear of God. Fear of God in the Torah is code word for having a conscience. When Abraham went to live in Gerar, he told the king Avimelech that Sarah was his sister so that they won't kill him and take her. And when Avimelech finds out that Sarah is really Abraham's wife, he says, "Why did you do this to me?" So Abraham apologizes and says, "I didn't know if there is fear of God in this place." Fear of God is basic human decency, right? What the philosopher Martin Heidegger called the call of conscience, right? So Shifra and Pua, the midwives, adhered to the call of conscience, and they didn't do what the king of Egypt told them to do, and they enabled the boys to live.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Someone
okay.
Here says, pikuach nefesh.
Pikuach nefesh means when life is at stake. For example, I drove my wife to a hospital on Shabbat when she was giving birth, right? And I was working with an ultra-Orthodox man who had a school in the synagogue I used to work for, and this ultra-Orthodox man, fully bearded, black hat, he drove his wife on Yom Kippur to give birth, to save a life.
But he drove her there, but he will walk home.
He probably stayed for the rest of the day. Yeah, that's true. Verse 18. The king. By the way, when people have the guts to do something, then sometimes the anti-Semitic power takes a step back. Do you know that there was a famous demonstration in Nazi Germany by the women who by the women who what's going on here?
Somebody's printing or something.
Okay.
Printing.
God is sending
Yeah,
the message.
okay. So there were German women, non-Jewish women,
Pekuach nefesh going on over there.
who were married to.
Jewish men.
Sorry,
Jewish men.
they were married to Jewish men, and they went to demonstrate outside the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. You know, the Nazi secret police headquarters, because they were going to take their husbands to a concentration camp. They took them in prison. They released them.
They released the men?
Yeah. Years later, they took them again, but
Of
they
course,
but
but
they
they-
immediately
yeah.
released them, which
Wow.
shows you
I know,
that
it's
that
just so
that
frustrating.
that when there is no apathy, then things can be done. I just watched a terrific TV series that I warmly recommend. It's called The Story of the Jews. And it's by a great Jewish British historian called Simon Schama. I think it's Schama. And you can watch it on Amazon Prime. And one of the amazing, it's a very powerful. He's a very bright man. He's
I
very
think
gifted.
I saw that actually
Yeah?
a while ago on some PBS station.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think it was
yeah,
originally
I
on
did see
PBS.
that.
So he says there that the case for Zionism, the case for the state of Israel, is not only quote unquote, what the Nazis and their many collaborators, there were many Hungarians, many Lithuanians, many Ukrainians, many Polish people, joyfully participated. Can I help you with something?
No, I'm
Okay.
sorry, just
it's
touched
okay.
something I
No, it's
shouldn't.
okay. Just want to make sure it's okay. But also the apathy of the outside world. The fact that no country was willing to take on Jews. There was a conference in the French Alps in Evian, a city called Evian, where only the Dominican Republic, right, in French Evian, only the Dominican Republic was willing to take a few thousand Jews. That's it. And then Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who was at that point the leader of the Zionist movement, says the world is now divided into countries that don't want their Jews and countries that won't let them in. And I have a really silly psychological thing about it, which is like, I can't bring myself to buy Evian water because whenever I see that word, I remember that conference. And after that conference, Hitler said, now we see the world in its hypocrisy. The world doesn't really want the Jews. And that emboldened him. You understand? But what I wanted to say is that those German wives that had German Jewish husbands, the Nazis took a step back. Watch verse 18. King Pharaoh, Melech Mitzrayim, says to the midwives, Madua asiten hadavar hazeh? Why did you do these things? Why did you let the boys live? In the next verse, verse 19, the midwives say to Pharaoh, they tell him a tall tale. They say the Jewish women are not like the Egyptian women. They're skilled midwives. They give birth instantaneously. Right? They give birth. Well, you know, there are women who give birth in 40 minutes, and there are women who give birth in 12 or 14 hours. But, you know, that's what they said. And God paid their reward. Verse 20. Vayitav Elokim lameyaldot. And the people grew more numerous. Now, verse 22, just skipping a little bit. Pharaoh decreed to his people, any boy who is being born should be thrust into the Nile, and any girl can live. So now Pharaoh, this is actually, Rashi says something fascinating here that many of us are not aware of. Rashi is saying that at this point, Pharaoh decreed also the murder of all the Egyptian male infants, not only the Jewish ones. And that shows you the evolution of a dictator. At first, they're only against the enemies. Then they become paranoid that any one of their own people is going to take over, and they start murdering their own people. Like the North Korean despot today. Did he kill his own brother? His uncle? That kind of, they get into that mindset that every little thing, they think that somebody is trying to oust them from power and assassinate them. And this brings us to the wise observation of Rabbi Sachs about contemporary modern anti-Semitism in Europe today, for example. For many years, perhaps even several decades, let's say in France or in Holland, different countries in Europe, they said, well, you know, the attacks of Muslim immigrants and their descendants on French Jews or on Dutch Jews is basically between two communities. It's like an exportation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But now we see that it's wrong, right? In the last couple of years, hundreds of Christian French citizens were massacred by Islamic radicals.
Yeah.
And we see that now throughout Europe. So Rabbi Sachs' devastating and astute observation is that anti-Semitism always starts with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. So the way a country treats its Jewish minority is the litmus test to what kind of a society it is. Is it a tolerant, decent society, or is it a racist and evil society? And here we see how Pharaoh started with anti-Semitism, and with time started also murdering his own people.
So they fear us because we're not trustworthy, or that we're so powerful.
Let me tell you how I see it. Again, here I'm a student of Rabbi Sachs, who explains that anti-Semitism is like a virus. If you look at anti-Semitism in history, you see the Jews were hated because they were capitalists, and Jews were hated because they were communists. Jews were hated because they were cosmopolitans who embraced every culture, and because they were too religious and just kept to themselves. Jews were hated because they were rich in Western Europe, and they were hated because they were poor in Eastern Europe. So anti-Semitism is really a set of contradictions. The only way to understand anti-Semitism is like a virus, a mental virus, which attacks the body politic of a given nation. And what do viruses do? In order to survive, they mutate, they change form. So in antiquity, there was pagan anti-Semitism. Then there was Christian anti-Semitism. They accused the Jews in medieval times of deicide. The Jews killed God, right? And then, so it was religious anti-Semitism. Also in the Islamic world, we were seen as infidels. And then in the 1800s, science became the new sacred cow. So Jews were hated racially. It was racism. They said Jews are genetically or ethnically inferior. And today, human rights is the new sacred cow. So they're saying that Israel is an evil state, and Israel, it's political anti-Semitism. So they say anti-Semitism is always irrational, and it's basically all internal contradictions. But in order to justify anti-Semitism, each time they take the most dominant value of that historical era and they place anti-Semitism on that. It could be religious, could be scientific, could be political. So really, it's a long and very deep and painful subject, Anti-Semitism is part of hatred of other people. It's the one type of racism that we have in the world, and we can talk about it for a long time.
Never and ever.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think it's important that non-Jews also participate in the fight against anti-Semitism, just like many Jews participate in the struggles against other forms of racism. Jews, 51% of the Jews, of the lawyers in the South during the civil rights era were Jewish. You know that?
Oh, yeah.
So it's important that it's a universal endeavor against all forms of
Has
racism.
ever been non-Jews fighting for the Jews?
Well, it depends how vocally. Yeah, let me give you the best example. The best and most spectacular example is Denmark. In World War II, there were about 7,000 or 8,000 Jews in Denmark. And when the Germans entered Denmark, they were trying to figure out what to do. And they basically took a bunch of ferries and they shipped overnight all 8,000 Jews from Denmark to Sweden. And Sweden was neutral, and they were all saved. Again, comes to show you that there is a lot that can be done.
Well, and not all Catholics, but some of the Catholic churches were helpful in hiding and aiding the Jews during World War II.
And
I mean, not as a whole, but you found a few here and there.
Other people feel also that the Pope at the time kept silent and that it was deplorable. I guess some people feel the Pope of the time felt that if he would open his mouth, he would risk his own existence. But, you know, it's a very tense and dark period also in the history of Jewish Catholic relationships. But, you know, we can talk about it ad infinitum. But we're going to jump a little bit in the interest of time and say that we're bringing, we have the birth of Moses.
Where's that?
I'm skipping. I'm taking us to verse 5.
It's
I'm taking us to verse 5, okay?
Oh.
Exodus chapter 2, verse 5. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Let me... it's on page 263 in English. And Pharaoh's daughter descended to bathe in the Nile, and her maidens with her. And she saw the basket in the midst of the marsh, and she sent her maid servants, and she took it. Now notice verse 6. She opened it, and she saw the child. He was a weeping lad. Rashi says he sounded like a youth, not like a baby. And here's the key term: Vatachmol alav, and she had compassion for him. And she said, "He is from the Hebrew, the children of the Hebrew." She had compassion for him. So let me tell you something very powerful, friends. Yesterday, one of the world's greatest writers passed away. His name was Aaron Appelfeld. He lived in Israel. He was a Holocaust survivor. He was a child survivor. So during the war, he would hide in the forest. His mother was murdered earlier on. His father was sent to a camp. He ran to the forest. Now in the forest, he learned how to milk cows and all kinds of things so he could survive. He could trust animals in the forest, but he couldn't trust people. Think about that. A child who knows he can't trust people. He doesn't know if this peasant will give him bread or turn him into the Germans. He could only trust animals. Here, we have Pharaoh's daughter. She has compassion for the Jewish baby, right? She is the first righteous Gentile person in history.
Yeah. What's her name?
It doesn't say, but the rabbis say in the Midrash that her name is Batya. They give her the name Batya. Bat means daughter, and Ya means God. She's the daughter of God. And of course, to this day, many Jewish women are called Batya, after her. And it shows that, our tradition and our culture, we judge people by their merits, not by their ethnicity, right? And the Talmud says that all the righteous people in all the nations of the world have a share in the world to come. Unlike some religions, where only if you believe their religious doctrine, if you adhere to their religious doctrine, will you have a share in the world to come. We are not that way. We say any decent human being receives, merits bliss from on high, right? So what I want to tell you now is something I think very deep about the human condition and about the whole story of the Exodus. I wrote about it last week a little bit. The Exodus took place, the healing of society, the emancipation, and the end of slavery happened because of people who had compassion, or what I called last week in my article, empathy. See what it says here on verse 6? Vatachmol alav. Vatachmol alav. She had compassion for him, for the baby in the basket. Later on, Moses has compassion for his own biological family, and he chooses them over his adopting family, which is Pharaoh's family. Later on, Moses has compassion for the Hebrew slave who is being afflicted by an Egyptian officer, right?
When you said
let me just finish the point. It's okay. And then Moses escapes to the desert lest the Pharaoh executes him. And he sees a group of non-Jewish women who are being harassed by a group of shepherds. And he intervenes and chases those shepherds away. Compassion for non-Jews. And at the very end, there's a midrash that says that Moses saw one of his sheep straying along the path and drinking water from some little puddle or something. And he felt bad. He said, I forgot to give the sheep water before we started the journey. So compassion. The compassion of Pharaoh's daughter, the compassion and empathy. Empathy, the ability to feel, connect to other people's feelings, that Moses had for his family, for his fellow Jews, for these non-Jewish women, even for the sheep. It's when we have empathy and compassion, then the world can maintain its humanity. But again, the Holocaust happened because of apathy, because nobody cared.
Well, nobody believed that.
Well, listen.
They knew. Everybody
in that book, in that series that I
knew.
told you about, the story of the Jews, there's a shocking story of a Polish man who was smuggled out of the ghetto or out of one of the camps in the early years, and he got to London, and he was knocking on all the doors, the American doors and the British doors, trying to stop the genocide. And nobody listened to him, and they didn't bomb the camps. They could have bombed the camps, the railways, to Auschwitz and Treblinka, where 2.5 million Jews were murdered. Almost half of the Holocaust happened in these two places, and they didn't.
The tracks, all they had to do was blow up the tracks.
And they didn't. And you know what? And then when his wife and son, he found out that they were killed, he committed suicide in London in protestation of the world's apathy. So, it's very depressing.
The American ambassador was there from the very beginning, and they knew. America knew. So when you say Bat Yah, daughter of, what's Yah?
Yah is one of God's names.
Oh.
Okay, so let's do. It's 10:45. Can we go until 11? Is that good?
Sure.
Okay. Now we're in the third Aliyah. We're in chapter 2, verse 11. And so it happened in those days. Vayigdal Moshe. Moshe matured, became a man, a young man. Vayitze elechav. He went out to his brothers. Already shows you that he was identifying with the Hebrews, even though he grew up in the palace. Vayar besivlotam. He saw their sufferings. Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'echav. He saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man of his brothers.
Oh yeah.
And Rashi explains that this person, the Egyptian, was a taskmaster. You know, he was like supervising the slaves.
Overseer.
And Rashi says that what was the Egyptian doing? He was lashing and driving the Hebrew slave. Very similar to the camps. In the camps also they had lashings. Verse 12.
Go ahead.
Okay, verse 12, very powerful verse. Vayifen ko vacho. Moses turned this way and that way. Vayar ki en ish. He saw that there was nobody there. Vayach et hamitzri. And he struck the Egyptian and he buried him in the sand. Okay, so...
Which word is sand?
The last word, bachol.
Bahol.
In the sand.
There's a discrepancy in line 11. It says he saw an Egyptian kill one of his fellow, and in this Torah it says
That's a bad translation because
beating a Hebrew.
Yeah, beating.
And this one says beating also.
Whoever says kill whoever translated kill translated wrongly.
Who?
The Hebrew word is makeh.
Oh, in here it says kill.
In the purple book.
Isn't the word for sand ish?
Yeah, it's a mistake.
Oh, it is a mistake.
Yeah.
So we should cross it out.
Well, the translation is a mistaken translation. The Hebrew, there's no problem with the Hebrew. It's a translation.
So makeh means beat.
Do you know how many things were lost in translation? The sixth
There's an entire
commandment.
movie.
The sixth commandment is in "You shall not murder," and it's translated to English as "You shall not kill." What a world of difference! "You shall not murder" means that we should sit here and let ISIS and Hezbollah take over the world because we don't kill. We're pacifists.
Yeah,
As opposed to "You shall not murder." What a world of difference, right? So the worst translation in history. Another one is, I'll tell you, it's very funny actually. It says that when Moses descended from the mountain after he came back with a second set of tablets, with the 10 Commandments, Moses was very upset. So God told him, take 2 tablets, right? But seriously, he was at such an elevated spiritual state that it says that Moses' face was beaming with light, with internal light, that the people were intimidated to look at him. So somebody translated that, and the word karan, which beaming, is spelled the same word as the word keren, which means horn. And that's why Michelangelo put horns on Moses.
Wait, Karen is, say that again?
Yeah. Keren means horn. Karan, the same words, letters. Kuf Resh Nun means beaming. So somebody translated it as instead of beaming, horns. And that's why Michelangelo drew Moses with horns. And that's why to this day there are primitive people out there that think that Jews have horns. You understand?
He was well versed in Hebrew then.
What?
He was well versed with the Hebrew. Or he must have got it from somebody.
No, he got it from a bad translation.
Karen and Karan, is it this letter or this letter?
Not the half circle, the other one.
The other one.
Okay, so this verse, Moses looked this way and that way and saw that there was nobody looking. Why do you think Moses looked this way or that way before he...
He was premeditated. He knew what he was going to do.
Yeah, but
And
why?
Witnesses.
Okay, so he wanted to make sure that there's no.
Nobody saw
Okay, that's what we call the pshat. the literal translation or the simple translation. There's a deeper level to it. This is correct, obviously what you're saying, but there's a deeper level to it, which is that he saw that nobody was going to do anything about it. So he decided he was going to step in.
Yeah, that's
You know those horrific stories about people who were attacked on the street in New York somewhere and people just kept on walking?
Yeah.
There's an elderly woman in this community who told me once, there was a wedding I was officiating and it was out of town, so I actually drove her home. She wanted to go home early. And we were talking and she told me how